Welcome to our review on the theory of evolution. So the first thing we need to do is go all the way back in time, pre-Charles Darwin and pre any understanding of this, and go back to see what people actually believed. And going back then people actually believed that all species were created by God. Now, in 1831, Charles Darwin got on board the HMS Beagle and went on a long journey which travelled around a large area of the world, but particularly we're going to focus on his trip around the Galapagos Islands. Now, these are little islands off the coast of South America. And when he was actually travelling around, he'd read this book on geology by this Scottish scientist called Lyell. And in that book, it was suggested that fossils were evidence of animals that lived millions of years ago. So that gave Darwin the idea that maybe things changed as time went on. When Darwin got to the Galapagos Islands, what he actually did was he took really detailed notes, did these amazing drawings, and just looked and observed the actual islands. And one of the best documented parts of his journey was about the different finches, which are a type of bird that he found on the different islands. And what he actually saw when he was looking at the different finches on all these different islands was that they had a different shaped beak, which was always linked in to the food source on that island. So those that had really sharp pointed beaks, they tended to be found on islands where they had nuts and seeds as the food source. And this was what actually led to his theory of natural selection. However, it wasn't just Charles Darwin who was working on this idea. We also have another scientist who was a Welsh biologist called Alfred Russel Wallace, and he was working in Borneo at the same time that Darwin was doing his work. And once he'd actually written his actual scientific paper, Wallace sent his ideas to Charles Darwin to carry out a peer review on it before he finally published it. Now, what actually came out as a result of this was that their ideas were incredibly similar. So both Darwin and Wallace actually presented their two papers jointly in 1858 because they both had this idea of natural selection and evolution being linked together. Now, Charles Darwin went on to publish his book on the origin of species in 1859, and this was kind of landmark, and it's kind of the reason we remember Darwin over Wallace, because that introduced his ideas to the non-scientific community. Obviously, when you're releasing a book saying that, you know what, the Bible's wrong and actually this is what happened, it was kind of controversial at the time. And he actually got quite mocked in the press. You can see the picture in the bottom left there was actually one of the pictures used in the national newspapers to just mock him for saying that both humans and our chimpanzees had a common ancestor. Obviously today we do not mock Charles Darwin because we know that his theory is actually correct, because we've got a huge amount of evidence through the fossils, through DNA evidence that support it. So this is why we now accept his theory so widely, whereas obviously at the time he published it was very controversial because it did go against the Bible and obviously the Word of God.